Welcome to our Dream Keepers discussion for 2025. I'm Jevon Caldwell-Gross, the teacher and leadership development pastor here at St. Luke's United Methodist Church, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of sitting down with Josh Riddick to talk about our experiences, his recent book, and the work that he's doing to help King's dream become a reality in 2025. Now, I'll confess that sometimes when I look at where we are as a nation and the conversations that we're still having today, it's so easy to lose hope, but it's conversations like these that get me energized to continue doing the work. Josh Riddick is a proud resident of Indianapolis and state organizer for Live Free USA. As a grassroots organizer, Josh is committed to building people-powered movements. And since moving to Indianapolis, Josh has been a pastor, racial equity trainer, civic dialogue facilitator, and founding organizer for the Black Church Coalition. He completed his graduate work in religious education and leadership from Rochester University in 2022 and has always been moved by the intersection of identity, spirituality, justice, and the development of emerging Black leaders. So I hope that this conversation invites you to have your own and energizes you for the work and the road ahead. Take a look, take a listen. So listen, Josh, let me just thank you for this opportunity. I'm excited for this conversation, and we talked before, and man, you have inspired me. And man, let me just say that you are a brilliant Black man.
Appreciate that, brother.
And I know that in our conversation today that I will learn a lot, and I think people listening will learn a lot as well. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you how we got here. So we've been doing some anti-racism work here at St. Luke's for about 4 years now. And it started in 2020. And it was one conversation that really challenged me that really brought us here 4 years later. Okay. So as we were doing our work, we were doing development with staff, the congregation, our volunteers. There was one older gentleman on staff who said, you know, this is really great work, but how do you all think about reframing the language to see how this helps Black people as well? And I thought, man, we've been centering all of our conversation around the white experience, and we haven't thought about how what's happening in our nation, how it's impacting people of color, you know, how it's impacting African Americans. And so we never gave them the opportunity to sort of voice their concerns and look at things from their experience. Sure. So I want to take this time just to share our experience. So, you know, it's nothing, you know, we don't have a whole lot scripted out. I just want us to make space in this new year of 2025 as we celebrate MLK Day is to really give space for just two Black brothers who come together and just sharing our experience and see what God might have to say through that. Sure. Sounds good?
I love it.
Well, listen, man, I know you've been doing a lot of great work in the city. You've been doing a lot of great work. I'd love for you to tell those who will be listening and watching some of the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the main thrust of the work that I have the gift and opportunity to do is organize people to build public power. And what that basically means, we align collections of people across a shared self-interest in the public arena, so politics, public life, and we organize to change policy, run folks for office, and ultimately make our city and our state a better place. Last week, we hosted an event at St. Luke's with a set of churches, had over 50 people show up, kickstarted a whole new movement, blown away by both how many folks came in the room, but also the hunger that people have in this moment to say, I don't want to just read a book. I don't want to just rage post. I want to put my hands to a plow somewhere and go make a difference in the public arena. And so I get to do that primarily through the Black Church Coalition, which is where my heart and soul tend to reside, organizing Black faith leaders. We're the largest organizing base of Black folks in the state of Indiana, building and wielding political power to change our community for the better. And we've done everything from reimagine public safety and help our city launch a mental health crisis response model that doesn't require law enforcement to go on mental health runs in significant parts of the city. We've gotten several of our leaders elected to public office, and we are excited for what we're going to continue to do at the State House this year. And then I have a third movement I have the gift of working with. I like to call myself the midwife of this movement. It's called the Validus Movement, which is a group of formerly incarcerated or justice-impacted folks who are organizing to reimagine and end mass incarceration. We want to reimagine a return home. We want to end mass incarceration. And so I call myself the midwife of this movement because while I've not been directly impacted or directly currently incarcerated, I understand a lot of our leaders have. And so we're going to end up hiring somebody who's got experience in the justice system and has served time that wants to build power and has come back home. So proud of that movement and honored to be part of that too.
That's great, man. Listen, man, I want to be like you when I grow up. You know? So let's tell me more about the work that you do with churches. I know you do a lot of consulting, and I would love for our audience to hear some of that work as well.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe the best way to frame it is kind of walk you through my own journey in relationship with church. So I grew up a church kid, like everybody in my family, culturally Christian folks. And so I grew up being accustomed to church. I also was in a multiracial home, and my parents got divorced. And because of the kind of spectrum of experiences my family had, I've been in a lot of different churches. You know, for a minute we were Baptist, for a minute we were Nazarene, for a minute we were Lutheran because I needed to go to a private school, and we needed a discount, so we had to go to the Lutheran church, which was my least favorite of the churches. That gave me this appetite to be in church spaces, this familiarity, comfort, flexibility. Around 14, though, I started to follow my own journey with God. And I had what some evangelicals call like a conversion moment. But that was when I was like, I want to take my faith walk seriously. So I deleted all of my illegally downloaded hip hop. And I illegally downloaded a bunch of Christian hip hop, and I ignored the moral quandary of that. And I started listening to this dude named Lecrae and people on his record label. And all of a sudden, I realized there's a whole art form of music that I can get down with that talked about God, talked about being a follower of God. And there was some theology that in hindsight was rather questionable. But for me, it did stoke for a seed in this appetite of, I remember some of the songs like Send Me to War. Like it was like this kind of like hyper aggressive language that you see in hip hop. Yeah. We weren't talking about shooting people. We were talking about to go die for Jesus in the streets. And I was like, I want to be outside. Like I don't want to be inside praying. I want to be outside with the people. And that started to cultivate this passion. I was doing food pantries as a high schooler. Went to a Christian college to be a pastor, not because I wanted to preach on Sundays, but because I wanted to be outside with people. And I didn't have an imagination for what that would look like in a role. Curious about politics, fascinated by it, never really could square at that young age how the church was supposed to be involved, but I knew there was something there. So when I get to college, and I have a lot of theology to undo, and we'll probably get to talking about that later. But one of the things I learned was that there was a tremendous divide between the theology that I carried into college and my experience as a black person in this country. I graduated high school the year the Trayvon Martin case was finished and watched my parents cry in the living room as that verdict came back, not understanding or having to face for the first time for them since Rodney King how much this country had not progressed and how disinterested it was in Black death. As a sophomore, junior, senior, we had Tamir Rice, we had Alton Sterling, we had Michael Brown. And at a Christian university, I felt that injustice in like a visceral way. But I looked around, and none of the folks that called me like brother in God, that worshiped with me, that went to classroom, that were studying ministry with me, saw that as a problem. And I remember the arguments I would get into, the debates, and I tried to respond by being, transgressive and more of a, I'm going to wear the Black Lives Matter shirt. And I thought that was being like a radical. It was really me lashing out at what felt like a direct assault on my identity and the fact that this university, this campus culture, the theology I carried had nothing to say about what God thinks about this. And thankfully, being in a space like that, I had some incredible professors, folks like Elise Woba, Eric Magnuson, Paul Patton, who pushed me towards more imaginative theologies. It's where I ran into like a James Cone and all the liberation theologies that came with it. And that started to unpack for me the things of, I had taken my blackness and said, this is my blackness, and I'd taken my theology, this is my theology, and they don't really mix. It's like the greens and the potatoes, I don't really want to touch it, but then when they did touch, it was spectacular. And I realized that God does have something to say about this. Yeah. And so when I left college, I was launched out of college, and I came to Indianapolis, what I desperately wanted was to work with the churches, to be outside like I had always intended. Yeah. But this time, speaking about the ways, contending in the ways in which injustice shows up in the world. And I stumbled through that and I struggled through that. I ended up in a lot of different congregational spaces, ultimately decided to opt out of that for a while, a lot of church hurt, and took a few years to say, I'm going to sit, God has not called me away from church. And I can't escape church when I'm trying to. But there is something that I've been invited to that I don't quite know what it is. And it ultimately ended up being organizing, working with congregations to build power to affect justice in the world. And it is felt at home. It is felt where I am most enlivened. But getting there was a heck of a journey and full of lots of pain and strife. But a lot of it was tied to my own formation and then having to undo and reform myself because of the theology, the culture, the narratives that were handed to me that quite frankly didn't honor the sacredness of Blackness, the sacredness of Black people, the sacredness of the Black experience as it relates to what God has to say about justice.
That can be such a pivotal moment in faith when your identity and your theology don't match, right? And especially, so when I was in a seminary, I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, and I've told this story to the congregation before, but it was a pivotal moment in how I felt in a religious institution to feel as though my identity was being attacked, right? So again, you have the best theological minds. I mean, it's best theological minds in the world. And we had these two professors who looked at theology with a wider lens. So it was a theology course, and instead of looking at the names that we would normally attribute to classical theology, they brought in the James Combs, they brought in feminists and womanist theologians. I mean, they brought in Gustavo Gutierrez. It was a phenomenal, and they said that we will look at theology from a broader perspective so that as we understand things like God's providence and God's sovereignty, what does it look like from different cultural lenses? And I was excited. I'm saying this is it now, right? So after that though, a lot of my fellow students, people I sat with at lunch, people who I called my friends, my colleagues, my brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, they were great preachers, they were great theologians. They got together and got a petition and wrote it to our dean of students because this wasn't real theology.
Right.
And they would not need this for their ordination exams, and they wouldn't need this when they go out into the world. So listen, these were trained theologians who were going out into the world to proclaim the gospel, who said that these other voices are not important enough for me to listen to. And I'm so upset about it. We will organize, right? We will organize around they didn't call it anti-Blackness, but we will organize around anti-Blackness because we don't think this is important. And I'm thinking, man, this might be the best class. And so then you have to wrestle with the reality that even in houses of faith, even in places that should be a refuge and sanctuary, that there's such a disagreement. And I would say the quandary was there was disagreement around what I perceived as my own identity. You know, like this is where I find hope and refuge. And this is where you find disagreement, you know, and I think that's what was troubling me, which is why I love your work, because you've had your own journey and you decided to go into these spaces and, do your transformative work and this is why your work is so important, is that you look at it from this theological lens and you understand church nuances, right? Because church is a different world. Like church, unless you're in it, there's nothing I can compare it to.
It's a beast in itself.
But you understand it. And you understand it so much that, you've got a book out, and the book is called Wait. And man, you guys look at how a church can become an anti-racist church. And I would listen. I'm not saying this just because we're here. I'm not. It is one of the best books I've read about anti-racism in a long time. And there's some other great work out there, but what yours does is that you guys look at it from a church perspective and you give some really practical things.
Yeah.
And it's not one of those things where church has to translate, where it say, hey, here's a principle, and how do we relate that to the church? No, you guys start from a church lens and you end from a church lens. And I think for those who are having that wrestling, I think you guys do a great job in that. So I would just want to bring up some quotes that you guys talked about. That, man, when I read it, I said, man, these authors are really doing a phenomenal job. So I want to go to a quote, and I just want to get your responses from it, and talk about some of the things that you guys wrote about. You said in here that the burden of being black in a white church, and I think you were talking about one of your colleagues, the burden of being black in a white church took a heavy toll on the spirit, which led to his departure. Hey, that's heavy, right? Because, again, we often talk about the lens of race and racism from a white perspective. It's educating white individuals, or that you guys call it is education or performing for, right? But you talk about the burden of being black, right? So what's that? Just talk about that from your perspective about the burden from being black in white spaces.
I might answer the question, but let me ask you a question, because I think your experience at Princeton frames it. When you got to Princeton, or even before you were there, did anyone prepare you for the betrayal that space is going to offer?
No.
Okay.
Nobody prepares you for the betrayal.
Okay. So that
and if somebody prepares it for you verbally, you don't really understand it until you feel it, because betrayal is based off of trust.
Yes.
And until you have placed your trust in certain places, because when you placed your trust in the betrayal, when you placed your trust in the area of trust, your theology, and you feel that betrayal, it makes you question so much, man.
Yes. So that's the answer, right?
Yeah,
like and one of the things that, whether it's organizing, whether it's consulting, whether it's coaching, is how do you frame and prepare people for the betrayal? Because to be black in multiracial spaces, to be black in predominantly white spaces, the betrayal is almost imminent. And without
wait, come on, hold on. You're moving too fast. You said something, and we're supposed to move on. Hold, stop, man, stop. Listen, right here. We're gonna put a pin right here. You said the betrayal is imminent.
Yeah,
it's going to happen. It's just a matter.
Yeah, when the foundation of our institutions and our systems has roots or is steeped or is framed in anti-blackness, then black folks become the subjects that get betrayed first. And so we are often necessary to perform an action towards, whether it's equity, justice, anti-racism. We're necessary participants. We are not always perceived as useful for the solutions. So when we talk about politics, politicians show up at our black churches, need you to vote, want to do better for you, and then when in office lack any urgency to commit to the things that help black people, substantive change to help black people. In institutional spaces, we're doing anti-racism or DEI work. We need high quality, high capacity, gifted black people to be in space to meet the quotas. But then we do very little to actually create the necessary safety and belonging for those folks. And we can just go through the list of all the different ways the betrayal happens. Again, I think about that first one for me, which was in college, to watch my roommate even, who later went on to work in law enforcement, get in my face and yell at me that if you just listen to the cops, they don't hurt you. And I'm like, that is not true. And a refusal by the people that I loved and I cared for to consider that the experiences that I've had, that people look like me have had, are valid. That felt like betrayal. And so for a lot of black folks, that only got happened about one time. And then we know, right? And then, for me, the experience of wanting to put trust in institutions and in spaces, I had to really wrestle with what that desire comes from. Because there are some folks, I'll tell you, when I got to Indianapolis, I was pastoring a predominantly white church, and I grew up mostly Methodist, and so I contacted a Methodist pastor that I heard preaching and teaching some incredible justice work, Reverend Jerry Davis III, Reverend Dr. Jerry Davis III, over at Crossroads AME. And I sat down and I told him about my vision, and he was gracious enough to listen. And I said, "Do you want to partner and collaborate?" He was like, "No." And it was just so blunt about it. And I've told him to this day that was one of the best no's I've ever heard, because it forced me to pause and be like, well, don't we want to be in community with each other? Why would we not? And that question of why would we not led me to the awareness of just how many times, how deep, how frequently those betrayals happen. Not just in individual people's public or professional life, but in congregational, institutional, political spaces. And so for a lot of the clergy that I work with, they're clear about the betrayal. And I came to this city not yet clear. And so the writing that you're coming to is after I've had some of those experiences. And for me as an individual, to your actual question, to be in, I remember writing about this particular church space, I thought I came in a lot more clear about where to put trust and where not to. And I still found myself experiencing that betrayal. And that particular season was rooted in my lack of wisdom around the intention to practice anti-racism does not preclude an institution from harming you.
Absolutely. Okay.
And I knew folks were going to make mistakes. I knew we were going to stumble and bumble. I didn't realize just how much betrayal I would experience and how the cloak of anti-racism would be used to hide and avoid accountability for that.
Here's the beauty of and the power and the persistence of Black people is that we experience the betrayal, and yet we have to carry on, right? We have to figure out a way of how do we still succeed and how do we still be our best selves, right? How do we do, and this is what Cornel West talks about this. He uses this, Cornel West was at Princeton, he was giving a lecture, and I remember him talking about Black love. And he used Emmett Till's death and said his mother, when they gave their funeral, she wanted to have an open casket so that people could see the harm for themselves. But she also, in that moment, talked about love. And the moment with the nation watching and her son had been brutally killed, she didn't talk about vengefulness. She didn't talk about hate. But what she focused around was around love. And that is the and this is why I think Black church is so important, or Black spaces and safety for Black spaces, is because you experience the betrayal, but you can't let the betrayal paralyze you, right? You experience the betrayal, but you still got to go into the spaces. You experience the betrayal, but in some ways you still have hope. You experience the betrayal, but you don't have the option of isolating oneself. And so you said the betrayal is imminent, right? It's going to happen, and yet we still choose to go into white spaces, and yet we still choose to collaborate, right? And yet we still choose to love, and yet we still choose to hope, right? We experience betrayal in so many different areas as a people, as individuals, in white spaces, and yet at the heart of who we are is still love and grace.
Sometimes.
Well, sometimes. Well, it's why we're still working through it.
But I think
right?
I think the ethic of love, and there's a way in which Black pain and Black people, in our deep desire to love on each other and love ourselves and love our community, justifies like continued exploitation. Right? Like the interrogation I invite leaders to go on who go back into those spaces where they've been betrayed is why. Like, what are we looking for in those spaces? What are you hunting for? What are you searching for? What are you longing for? Sometimes there is a clear self-interest that can be achieved through those spaces. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's our own internal work we have to do to root out anti-Blackness in a way that actually allows us to realize, like, I was looking for something in this space that I didn't think my own context, my own community, my own people had. Sometimes it's a doorway for a temporary moment. I mean, whatever it is, like I'm not going to assign value to it, good or bad, but to invite that interrogation, right? Like Emmett's funeral, I believe, was in Chicago, really, really hot day, like his body's decomposing. There's a reason that his mom had it in that place. And the ethic of love was not because she wanted to go be back with white people. She was in a black part of Chicago to love in a public way on her people.
That's it.
That's it. I wonder sometimes when we've experienced the betrayal, do we love ourselves enough? Do we love our people enough to like really reckon with what's required of that? Because like sometimes we've been betrayed and we want to close a casket on a thing and bury it as quick as possible because we don't want anyone to see the body. Sometimes we don't even want to go to the funeral because we don't want to acknowledge it hurts. So that when the betrayal happens, like what we then do with it, to me is always a interesting, informative practice. And it is some of the hardest soul work I've had to do to really ask the question after the betrayal, like, why am I still here? Like, what am I trying to do? Why do I need this space or feel like I need this space? And, come to the conclusion, well, you don't. I'm like, well, why did I still, what's keeping me here? I can talk more about what that was for me and the breakthroughs around that, but can be debilitating to experience a betrayal and then equally weighty to have to wrestle through the nature of where it is and why it's so heavy.
And I think you brought up a great point because I think when you talk about pressing through, I'd agree in terms of it's not necessarily going back into white spaces for the sake of going back into them, but I think it's going back into any space with an idea and a confidence of self-love, right? To know that there are spaces, it's almost like still going back into that Princeton classroom talking about theology, knowing that it was important, right? Knowing that those black voices of men and women, knowing that, Gustavo Gutierrez talking about theology of the poor is just as important, and it's this idea of, again, I love when you said that it's imminent, because I think what it does, it shields us from this idea that even though that there might be work being done, that doesn't isolate us from the harm that's still present.
Coming.
It's coming.
What do you do with that?
When it comes? So listen, man. So let's talk. Let's just stay on that for a little bit because I think there's a common thread there. Because in your book, you talk about the same page. You said the fleeting moments that centered our blackness came during worship times. But as those moments became less and less, the urge to leave to find spaces for belonging instead of being seen as entertainment grew. So how do we, and you guys actually do a great job of talking about, as you are recruiting BIPOC individuals, how to create safety, how to create places of safety, create places of belonging. And when you are going into different spaces, what's a feeling of belonging feel like and look like for you?
I mean, the feeling of belonging is like being in the barber's chair. Yeah. Like it feels like when I first sit down in the barber's chair. Yeah. The feeling of belonging is when it feels like I am hearing the bass of like a hip hop song in the background of a thing. And I know the verse. Yeah. That's being rapped. Like that's what it feels like. Cultivating those spaces in institutions where there's limited or a low amount of folks of color can be difficult. And, I give a shout out to one of my homies, Melissa Cordero in Tampa, Florida, was part of this large, and it grew so quickly, this like micro church movement in Tampa. a lot. I think it was InterVarsity folks that come together in the mid 2000s, graduated college and launched this, I thought was innovative micro church network. And I went down to go check it out because it looked like they're doing church pretty different. And incredible. I mean, Tampa's incredibly diverse, much more than Indianapolis because of the high population of the different Caribbean and Central and South American cultures that are there. And I remember pulling up and being like, "So this is so cool! Like y'all are really doing it." And she was again like, "Not gonna hide the betrayal from me. There's been ways this place has really harmed us, and instead of, folding over and accepting that." They ended up creating this space called the Roots Project. And the Roots Project was the first time I got to witness folks navigate racial trauma and racial identity in a productive way for folks of color. It was exclusively a community of color, mostly Black-led, that was oriented around people unpacking their own racial identity. Because in the anti-racism world, we spend so much time trying to coach white people along, there is a very real sociological process for Black people and other folks of color to have formation around their racial identity. And this space took that serious. Now, for many other people, they experienced that through an HBCU, through their fraternity or sorority, through Black church. But for me, it was the first time I got to watch this really, really broad spectrum of Blackness go through this together. And I remember being in the room and just watching, not really talking, but I felt so at home. And I felt like I had been there forever. In the way that afterwards, they pulled me aside and said, well, let's start asking about you and asking questions about me and really pressing me to know your people. Yeah. Right? Often in coaching space, I ask people, who are your people? Where are you from? Not where you were born, but like, where are you from? Where are your people from? And who do you belong to? And a lot of folks struggle to answer this question. People, regardless of their racial identity, but like when you really get into it with folks of color, Black people in particular, we start to reckon or acknowledge what anti-Blackness in the world might have cost us, was taken from us. When I started digging into that, who are my people and where are they from, realizing that because of the way Jim Crow worked, my granddad took over sharecropping at 14 for his family. And never got to be a boy, didn't know how to quite be a man, but did the best he could. Raised my dad to the best of his ability. But there was a lot of brokenness in our family because of that. And I started to find some other family members and do that kind of lineage work and realize that even after enslavement ended, the first generation of freed people, one of my ancestors, we have a record of him giving away a 13-year-old daughter to a guy who struggled with alcoholism up the road who had lost his wife. And I'm thinking, that's what Massa did. And we didn't have the healing properties yet, the time, the space, probably the resources to recover from what was done to us in that moment. And then that just passes down generationally. So I take that work very seriously because for the first time in a couple hundred years, like I have an opportunity to undo some of the harm, not perpetuate or continue some of the harm. My dad did the work he could. I'm gonna do the work I can, and hopefully that as we go through that process. But to really know the harm, to be clear about where it hurts, you have to be able to look back and look deep into your own story, and pull everything out. Yeah. And some of that stuff is hard to see because it's rooted in the type of narrative in anti-Blackness that isn't good and isn't healthy. I mean, I give you an example. I didn't realize how curly my hair was till I was in high school. Because my dad was like, you keep that hair short, boy. And some of that was he was highly conditioned by the military. And then for me to have long hair was probably largely a gendered and a cultured thing. That wasn't exclusive to Black people, but it then showed up in a way where, do I know how to love the way in which God made my hair? I liked it my hair was short, but like as soon as I could, as an adult, I was like, I'm getting locks. Let's make it happen. Like we done with this short fade. Like it's time to get some locks. And that for me was a small way in which I could say, I'm going to claim a part of myself that I had never, and even when I got locks, right? I had family members and friends like, you ain't gonna get a job, brother? Like, what you? Yeah. And I was like, no, like that's okay. It's all right. And there's still that deep fear because of the betrayal that then people then shape how we move forward in the world.
Maya Angelou has this, she has this quote, and I would love to just talk a little bit about decentering whiteness. Because as you talk about this idea of your own narrative and how you begin to look at yourself, outside of all that. She has this quote, or she has this idea when she's talking, I think somebody asked her about her own writing, and she talked about how her writing changed when she no longer had like the white gaze over her shoulder, is when she liberated herself from like decentering the idea of white norms, that she always looked at her own self, her own writing, her own gifts through. And it wasn't until she decided to no longer pay attention to that gaze is when she started to excel as a writer, because they said that her audience was too limited. They said that if you're writing to Black readers, you never make it. And so she didn't write. But then when she began to liberate herself from that gaze, and I think so much of kind of who we are, it's so interesting when I've pastored 2 Black churches prior as a lead pastor. And man, I'm not exaggerating. They're wonderful congregations. But when I first got there, in both congregations, they were declining immensely. And it was so interesting because in both of the predominantly Black settings that were geared towards predominantly Black people, there were very little signs of Black expressions of worship, cultural norms. And I remember one congregation specifically when we would even try to introduce Black music or Black sensibilities, they almost saw it as an insult, because to be good United Methodist was to have an undying commitment to Eurocentric sensibilities. And I mean, you get a church full of Black people, and there were no music written by Black people. We would sing 7 hymns a Sunday, every single verse, right? But it's only maybe doing Black history we might do something, but it had to be at the hymnal. I mean, and it was any sign. And I remember one visitor came to church one Sunday, and this is when I knew, like, man, we gotta do something different. We had an Asian lady who came to our congregation, and she was looking for a church to go to. And she said, I wanted to come to a Black church so that I could hear some gospel music, so that I could experience Black church. And I'm thinking in the back of my mind, this ain't you have come to the wrong one. You're not gonna get it here. You're not. And so, but even in the congregational setting, we were centering the idea of what good worship was around the gaze that Maya Angelou talked about. And I'd love to just, hear your thoughts. You guys talk a lot about decentering whiteness in your book, I would love for you to talk about the impact of decentering whiteness as we go through our own journeys.
Yeah, I mean, I go to an AME church. That's where I call home. So it would be remiss to say that, that sometimes the joke in Black Methodist spaces like AME or AME Zion is that Black folks in the United Methodist thought the white ice was too good and too cold. So we want to stay. But there is in that kind of tongue-in-cheek joke, there is also this wrestling that folks have to do around, we like this space because it's proper and it's correct, and the language we start talking about, whether it's our liturgy or our music, it's the right way to do worship, which somebody probably told you when you start asking questions. Those things point to, a perception. And so I think, we say decentering whiteness, there is a way in which the conversation around anti-racism only exists to help white people navigate their guilt and their shame. And decentering whiteness as a practice is to say, we're not going to have Eurocentric models for everything that we do. We're going to interrogate that within ourselves and amongst others. But I also think, for Black folks in particular, it is a internal and public practice of identifying where anti-Blackness shows up. Because we sometimes adopt or embody whiteness that shows up through anti-Black rhetoric, theology, liturgy, performance, finances and funding. We try to be like the white folks and all that we do. It is often tied to class, and we don't interrogate class. So I think that's a way that we can do that work. For kind of white-led or predominantly white institutions, this notion of decentering whiteness was always like the journey that they said they wanted to go on. And the invitation I would give people to do is spend an immense amount of time interrogating and investing in your story as an institution and then as individual people within that institution to identify where precisely and where exactly did your family and cultural lineage pay something to get brought into whiteness. Because the historical part that most people don't really recognize is that for a period of time in this country, to be white is fundamentally different than what it means today. If you were Anglo-Saxon, you were white. If you were Italian, you were not. If you were Anglo-Saxon, you were white. If you're Irish, you were not. And then those things started to shift to be able to maintain dominance and control. And so for most people in this country, if they really do the story work, they can start to see that my family adopted a particular class identity. My family adopted a particular cultural or religious identity. My family adopted even a racial identity. At a certain point in history, for a lot of white folks, that was in the first half of the last century, where they said, oh, we moved out of the city and went to the suburbs when I started school. Why was that? We bought the house in this neighborhood when my friend moved in who was black. I don't know why that was. We used to go to this church, and they got a woman as a pastor. They went to this church. And we can start to see the ways in which our families made decisions. And black folks got to do this work too. It's a little different. But we can start to see the ways that we made decisions to separate ourselves from black people, adopt kind of white norms, white normativity, at the cost. And I try to tell this to everybody. It is always at a cost. Yeah. It is an expense to get into the club. And there's always some benefits for people, but it ain't free. Yeah. And whiteness has a burden and a cost to it that for a lot of people, the benefits outweigh it. But people are not in tune or accustomed to assessing what that cost is.
There's a cost when, if we look at it from both angles, for a black individual who decides to walk away from their gaze, there's a cost to that. You gotta be willing to pay the cost to that, But there's so much benefit on the other side of that. And then for white institutions to decenter whiteness, there's a cost to that too. I went to Kalamazoo College. It's a small liberal arts school in
Shout out to
Michigan.
K College.
Yeah, K College, man. And I've told this to our congregation a few times, but man, we had a president by the name of Dr. Wilson O.E. Laring. And Kalamazoo College when I went there, was 97% white. I mean, I can name every person of color in my class. It was, especially those individuals who, were African American, it was 6 of us. 4 of us was from Detroit, 1 was from Kalamazoo, and the other dude lived in Japan, right? I mean, and that was it. Like, that was who our class was,
Yeah.
And so we had a president who was the first black woman president in our history. And I was actually on the board at that time, and I remember her casting this vision for Kalamazoo College. Again, it's a prestigious liberal arts school, prided itself on study abroad, high education, great institution.
Yeah. Rigorous.
And, very, very rigorous. And so, and I want you to keep that idea of rigorous as I make some of these comments. So, or some of these comments about her responses to the vision that she laid forward. So, as the first black woman president of the college, she talked about the need for diversity. And she said that if we are creating students, and I think part of our mission was around creating the next generation of leaders or leaders to go into a complex world. And she said, if we're creating leaders to go out into the world is not homogeneous. We live, this world is composed of people from different backgrounds, and we want to prepare people that their first experience with difference is not when they leave K College. That's and right. So there's some brilliant people around she talked about decentering whiteness. We had an admissions director who said that we cannot get qualified Black students to come to Kalamazoo College. I mean, we can unpack that in so many different ways, right?
Yeah.
He wasn't there too long, right? We would have complaints around security because some of us used to get stopped on campus at night questioning. Now, again, there's only a couple of us there, right? But so many of the males had experience of being stopped. Security changed. The qualifications for tenure, it changed. The kind of food they served in the cafeteria, it changed. The kind of students that we would recruit. I mean, we had students from abroad, students from California, from New York. I mean, I just went there for my 20th year reunion. I didn't recognize the place. I'm like, man, like this, it was beautiful. But I remember when she laid out the vision, I remember it clearly. You talk about, remember, you said it was imminent. I remember you said it was imminent. I remember some of my colleagues I graduated with were very saddened by her vision because they said they didn't want to lower the standards of the college. Right. No, wait a minute. She said, as a part of the vision of creating an environment where we're creating leaders to go out into a diverse world. And so we want to reflect the diversity in the world in our campus. And people thought that was analogous. This rigorous place that if we are more diverse, then that goes against the idea of this. It will no longer be a institution with a rigorous education.
That's right.
And when you talk about that betrayal again, well, was like, wait a minute,
And I'm certain K College at the time would have had a mission statement or a DEI statement, would have had a Title IX department, it would have had a DEI vice president. It would have had a advisory committee on multicultural studies and had multicultural studies. It had a gender studies department. It had all the metrics that we look for. And yet, it still behaved in the same way, right? So Professor Joy James over at Williams College says that kind of the white liberal hegemony, and she calls this the algorithm of anti-racism. We can adjust the chairs around the table. We don't ever change the table.
Yeah, sure.
That white folks are willing to be led by somebody else, but they still reserve the right to reign. And so we'll let this.
So you move past these things so fast, man. You just drop these bombs. You move. Go back, man. Go back. Say that again, and let's unpack it.
We change the seats around the table.
We change the seats.
We don't get rid of the table. We can change who leads, but kind of the white system construct still has the right to reign.
Wow.
So we will get that black woman, and we'll be proud that we got the black woman as our president. We are proud that we had the first black pastor to do. We are proud that we have this diverse deacon board or trustee board. We are proud of this new committee. Whatever thing you want to throw out there. We launch it, we get the benefits of it, but we don't change who gets to actually reign. And I mean, my sister graduated from K College in 2018.
I did. You did. Did you mention that?
I didn't say the year.
Okay, fair enough.
So,
fair enough.
I go up and visit her, right? So the way you talk about the university, I remember being followed by security visiting my sister, right? I remember driving to a food co-op up the road and being like, oh, I forgot, like Kalamazoo, like is in the hood.
Yeah.
But that wasn't reflective in the immense wealth that was found in the college. There was a very sharp divide. I mean, K College is on a hill. Yeah. You go down the hill.
Yeah, that's
you're
right.
in the city, right? And so, like, geography and boundaries are reinforcing of remember who gets to reign still.
Wow.
Like we'll put the black kid from the Kalamazoo Promise Scholarship on the flyer. He gets to come represent the DEI coalition, but he don't get to reign.
And so I think for at least white institutions, because we always talk around deconstructing faith, and I think we're in this culture now that people are really intent and committed on deconstructing their previous faith experiences to create something more healthy.
Sure.
And whenever we talk about deconstructing faith, it can be hurtful, harmful, but We are committed to that because we know, again, deconstructing faith will cost you something. So I've got to undo a lot of the things that I've learned in order to create a more healthy understanding of who I know God and faith to be. And I think using some of that same language in their own process of decentering and deconstructing whiteness for white institutions, it's going to hurt.
Absolutely.
And it's going to cost. And I think a lot of predominantly white institutions have to, and K College, I can say, again, I would be interested to hear what the narrative of people have to say now as it was 20 years ago, but I think in some ways is that it did cost us something. There are some people who say, we lost some donors. We lost some people who thought that we were going down, But I remember when we did that, there was one donor who said, if you all are committed to this, he gave a lot of money. And we realized that, man, we as an institution and as a college has so much to benefit, but they were willing to go through that painful period of, we are losing whiteness as the center, but we're gaining so much more. Because for a lot of that institution, it felt like a huge loss. It felt like they were losing something that was their glue. But on the other side was, even now we have a male president who's Hispanic, and just the different lens that he brings. I mean, it's just a different place. And so I think it's possible to do that. What do you think decentering looks like? Let's kind of stay on this for a little bit. What do you think, because you've worked in predominantly white settings and you still go and do consulting work, what does decentering whiteness look like as individuals, especially those who operate in white spaces?
Well, there's a few kind of questions I tend to ask folks. Basic one, we talk about this thing in churches: time, talent, and treasure. Like where do you place your money and invest your money into? How do you think about sustaining a future for your children? Who are your people? Those are questions I start with, because what it gets to is I try to spend somewhere between like 60 to 80% of any discretionary income I have on Black business organizations, suppliers, whatever. And when I started doing that, I realized just how little I considered keeping my money in my community as an act of justice and equity. I considered how little I thought about the individuals that I was paying to do services or provide. That forced me to really reckon with some things, right? There's all sorts of ways that most people who are going to listen to this have read some sort of anti-racism book. What books do you read? What podcasts do you listen to? Like, that's fine. But I think the real internal work is related to power and how you think about power. And I think the fascinating thing is, and I am forgetting the woman's name who wrote it, but there is a old article called A World Without Rape and a World Without Racism. And the author is from, I believe, rural Ohio, and talks about the ways in which racial narratives existed in her family lineage. And the harm that Black people were supposedly going to cause if we didn't protect ourselves, how dangerous Black men were, how much we had to keep a distance from these folks, while at the same time saying nothing of the predators that existed in this woman's family. Nothing of the folks who were perpetuating sexual harm and violence to her mother, to her aunties, to her cousins. And most white folks that I do this work with, I come to the conclusion that there is deeply entrenched racial narratives, deeply entrenched gender narratives, but I can boil it down to a very simple question of like, who causes harm in your family? And what do you all do about that? Because the really messy work is that grandpa sexually harmed kids in the family when he was younger, or this cousin did that. So when I don't really spend a lot of time with my family, actually, or when we're at the family gatherings, we stay a distance over here, or I moved out of the state and went to a far different college because my dad was terrible and abusive or an alcoholic. Like all of that, like really digging into that story often tells me how people think about and practice repair, practice safety, practice belonging. and practice escaping systems of harm.
Wow.
Because often there's this kind of individualized move to put up a wall,
Yeah.
to hide, to ignore. And when, as I believe Ruby Sales says, when she talks about white people needing a white liberation theology, the core question is, where does it hurt?
Where does it hurt? Yeah. That's it.
And a lot of white folks run from that pain and run from that hurt. So you can diversify your book list all you want. You can listen to all sorts of different podcasts if you'd like. You could even attend a black church and call that your home. That's a transgressive move, but a lot of white folks don't do that. But to me, the soul work that ends up being more transformative is to ask the question, where does it hurt? And to go really deep with that. Because what I have found in the way too many hours I've spent coaching through these spaces, the folks who have done the harm are the ones who first offered some of those narratives around racial identity.
Wow.
The folks who didn't protect from the harm are the ones who reinforced it. And so while we might create distance, we go to therapy and get some healing, we sometimes react or adjust to those things. Like I think about the people that I know who have this incredible world they've constructed to keep their kids safe from sexual violence, from what's happened in their families. So I live in this place. I have these systems set up. I have this awareness I'm always thinking about. I have these conversations with my kid, but I've never talked to my mother about it.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? So if that is your reality with a deep pain that you're aware of, how then do you develop the tools to talk about something that is also a form of pain with those same people? And usually you don't. So I don't go to Thanksgiving no more because I don't do this. I unfriended my dad or my uncle from Facebook. You don't need to fix these people.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the objective. But like the own wrestling that one has to do often is avoided because we really get into what hurts.
Here's why you are challenging me with this. Here's why you are challenging me with this, and I'm upset with you right now because you're really challenging me. So let me tell you how you. I have 3 kids, and remember you said that the betrayal was imminent, and as you talk about pain, as you talk about working through it, and even sometimes avoiding it. I think sometimes pain is hereditary in terms of our inability. If we don't work through it, we pass it along. Just the same way our kids might pick up on behaviors. Doesn't matter. Regardless of the family structure you're around, whatever the parental structure looks like, there are certain things that are hereditary that we pick up just by proximity. And I think even for me as a black parent, I've got to be so cognizant of the pain that I carry and the pain that I've worked through or the pain that I haven't worked through and the distrust that I still have. In some ways, I've tried to protect my kids from that, from the imminent betrayal. And it's so interesting, man, is that... So I grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood. I went to a predominantly black church, and I went to a predominantly black elementary school. Like every area that I was in was predominantly black. I was affirmed. My narrative as a young black man was shaped very early. Again, always evolving and growing. But the dominant voices, the dominant narratives, those were the even growing to AME Zion Church. So it wasn't until I went to high school and Kalamazoo College, even high school I went to was in Detroit. So there was still like the dominant narrative of blackness and black identity, even though it was a diverse school, was still present. It wasn't until Kalamazoo College where and then, so what's interesting is though my kids, most of their spaces are all white, and they experience betrayal very early on, and I've told some of these stories. My daughter, my son in particular, he was in 2nd grade when he got his betrayal. They were riding bikes in the neighborhood. There was a girl in the 2nd grade called them the N-word. You know, I mean, they played with this girl every day. He used to come over to the house, you know, we fed her, you know, it's like neighborhood kid, you know, and just use the N-word just so, you know, somebody taught her that word, right? And so, but it didn't dawn on me that we would have to have conversations around, and at the time my daughter didn't know what it was. You know, she came home, you know, but my son knew. And so it was almost this idea of, I tried so hard as a parent to like shield them from the imminent betrayal. And I think sometimes as a Black parent, I go, again, this is not, Black is not a monolith experience. We all parent differently, our experiences differently. But I've got one child that likes to express themselves in certain ways where I'm afraid they're going to be stereotyped, you know, a certain way.
Sure.
And I sometimes have to check myself and say, is this my own version coming through of, you know, is this the white gaze again of how he will be perceived? Is it me being overprotective? Is it still not being able to work through the pain of the betrayal that I'm hoping he won't experience, you know? And so, and it's this idea of the pain that I haven't worked through and being inflicted upon the next generation.
Yeah.
Because I think in some ways, and it might be different in terms of, I've learned so much about race and racial identity moving back and coming to the Midwest. And it's different.
Yeah, the lines are really harsh.
It's the things, and what's so interesting is that not only have I challenged myself in terms of working through my own pain, I am aware that our kids are around in spaces where others have not worked, particularly white individuals haven't worked through that pain either, you know, and so they clash all the time, you know. And your work, as you look at how we're moving forward as a community, how we're moving forward in institutions, where are you finding places of hope? You know, for me as a Black parent, seeing some of these experiences, man, hope looks very bleak sometimes. You know, it looks like, man, like if this is what we're dealing with now, you know, I mean, they've had to learn that 13, 11, and 8. And the crap that they've had to work through is depressing.
Yeah,
you know? And that's why I'm so glad you're doing the work. You know, I'm so glad you're doing the work.
Yeah.
Because as a Black parent, I've got to send them out to some of those same places where I may not always trust. You know, so I've got to find places of safety and places where they can. So as you're speaking to the Black parents who are listening, who might experiencing their own struggles and trials and how to navigate certain areas, as you're working with these entities and institutions, where are you finding places of hope and places of progress?
Well, let me say this. I've been called the N-word on 3 continents.
Absolutely.
Fun fact about me, India was one.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Group of school kids, 5-year-olds started. We was walking through a soccer game. I said, pass me the ball. They all turned and was like, nigger. And everybody started yelling it. And I was with some white peers. It was in college. And they were like, oh, my God, what's happening? And I was like, oh, so this is what we mean when we say anti-Blackness is a global thing, right? Same in South America and then, of course, this continent. So I say that, not to make a joke, but to say that anti-Blackness is a global export. That in every culture, you know, in India, they follow a caste system. The caste system is based on tonality of skin. Darker you are, the worse you are. That is a product of colonialism. It's a product of anti-Blackness, reinforced and accelerated by those things. So when I'm just making some notes on some of the stuff you were sharing, I think the wrestling that folks have to do demands that we consider the scope and scale of anti-Blackness. You talked about growing up in a Black elementary school in a Black neighborhood, going to a Black church. There was narratives you were given at a young age around what a good neighborhood is, what a good school is, what a good education, what a safe community is. And as you've got older, you have tried to construct a world for your kids the best way you know how. And the ways that we have been told are the best are sometimes steeped in anti-Blackness too.
Absolutely.
And, you know, you're talking about the pain of your kids being betrayed, but like you feel that pain too. Because you understand your job as a parent is to keep these kids well and whole and feel you don't want them to hurt. You never want your kids to hurt. And yet you know you can't fully protect them from that. And some of the spaces you have created that you were told were the right things are the source of that pain. And there becomes a tremendous complexity of I did everything I was supposed to do. I thought I did it the right way, and yet my kids are still getting hurt. The back work from that, like working backwards from that, is like the places that I was told, the spaces that were supposed to be good, why were they said to be good? Why were they said to be okay? My own experience, you know, I 20 years ago, I was entering late elementary school, early middle school, and beginning to be really frustrated with this Lutheran school that I had to keep going to Lutheran church for. And I wanted to leave. And so at 13, it's 3 years later, after 3 years that you got to college, I'm looking at schools. And we're living in Albion, Michigan.
Oh, yeah.
25 minutes from K College.
Yeah.
Albion High School was on the verge of closing. It was the only public high school in the city. Why was it closing? Because public policy, driven by a set of folks who wanted to end public school for black children. Detroit had a bunch of school closures at this time. Yep. Battle Creek had a bunch of school closures at this time. The state was shutting down schools in the one public high school, which was predominantly black. I was picking a middle school so I can go to a high school. And my parents said, look, we want you to go to a good school, get a good education. And in that frame, Albion High School was always at the bottom of the list. Yep. It was considered unsafe. In some ways it was. I ultimately went to a white rural school, a school that, while had certain academic premiums that Albion didn't have, the same policies that targeted Albion actually hit Homer. Because working class white people are often caught up in anti-black policy. But also, the type of safety that my parents imagined did not include safety from racial harm.
Say that again.
The type of safety that my parents imagined didn't fully include racial harm, right? So the type of racism I encountered, indirectly or directly, and the psychic effect it had on me, and the way it impacted my spirit, my mental health, I never even told them about it till after I left, because I thought this was the right thing, this was good, and that's just part of the cost. And when I look back on it, I got into Spring Arbor University. I'd have got in there if I went to Albion. My formation around what I was going to do after high school was not shaped by my high school. It was shaped by my community of faith. It was shaped by my family. That was always going to be a dominant force. Are there factors I can't perceive or know of that would have been happened if I went to this school? Absolutely. But my entire four-year high school experience was shaped out of a fear of black people. We would never say it that way. And to this day, if I framed it to my family, it would be haunting. But Albion was perceived as the worst option possible because it was black. So now, as someone who has kids that are entering education, I'm like staunchly committed to making sure my kids go to the neighborhood school. And I'm not going to critique folks who make decisions otherwise. That's not my job. My job is to invite people to do the wrestling with how they get to that decision matrix. Some people are very clear. I'm middle class. I'm sending my kids to this school because I want them to go to this university. All right. We can wrestle with that, but some people are clear. That's their self-interest. One thing organizing has been clear to me, you don't judge people's self-interest. That's a public relationship with most people. All right. For the people that are in my circle, though, and my folks, I want to do that wrestling with them. Like, are we really clear about what a good neighborhood means, what a good school is? When we start talking about folks' kids, that's when you really get to people's like core values and assessments of the world. So I don't know what your original question was.
No, I think this is great because I think in some ways kind of going full circle a bit because we talked about those places of safety and belonging. And it's interesting, we're part of this organization, Jack and Jill, so that they have spaces. I know people might critique in terms of the classes and things like that, but but man, it's a clear space where they're valued.
Yes,
it's a clear space where they're affirmed.
They will love on you.
It's just a clear space to do that again, because a lot of the areas that they are in doesn't always do that overtly. Because I think what you talked about this a lot in terms of the idea of anti-Blackness. And in the book, you guys talk about how language shapes culture. And I want to talk about anti-Blackness for a bit because at least we talked about places that might be hopeful, where you might be seeing hope and where there's some gaps might be. Man, I promise you, man, we'll get back to it. When I look at the language we use today, even how we talk about race and how we talk about Blackness, that's why I say sometimes, man, I'm not always as hopeful as I should be, not just as a parent, but as I look at the things that they go through, but even how we talk about Blackness, you look at, the idea that we're taking certain books out of schools, and sometimes we have politicized some of these things without doing the internal work and without doing the investigation work with it as well. There was a huge conversations not recently, but in the last couple of years around CRT. And then, just have this idea around being woke. If you bring up race, any shape, form, or fashion, that there are some that will label it as being woke, so won't even engage in the conversation, And even, man, I was looking, again, I told you about how I grew up, and I remember reading books. These were books that we read as part of the curriculum. We read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. This was in high school. I took a African-American literature course, and even kind of going throughout my, we read Beloved. We read The Bluest Eye. College, we read Native Son, Invisible Man, Their Eyes Are Watching God, Go Tell It on the Mountain, James Baldwin. Like, these were part of my own narratives. And then to hear, I remember reading something and they talked about how certain books served a political agenda and we're indoctrinating our kids to a woke agenda. I said, what? Like, this is like when Maya Angelou was writing down The Caged Bird Sings, it wasn't political. It was, again, her taking that gaze off of her shoulder and letting the Black experience be the center of the narrative. When you think about anti-Blackness, and what are some of the ways that we're seeing that today, contemporary? As we're looking at certain things that we're seeing, and some may see this as a political conversation. I don't see it political at all. I see it as ways that impact people's daily experience. When one of my children comes home and says, they had a substitute teacher. They were in one of their social studies classroom. They were going to talk about slavery that day. And they had a substitute teacher, and they were given a note to not go over that section. Well, the substitute teacher said that I think this is important for everybody to learn. And we're actually going to talk about it today. And for her to not, hope I'm not getting her in trouble, but to her to say, we'll engage in this because this is actually part of American history. Like, they have everyday ramifications, as parents, when we have to make sure that our children read books by Black authors. When we let them watch documentaries because we know they're not going to get the narratives at school. They're not. So we have an extra responsibility of making sure, because you guys talked about, and I just want to, I'm going to talk. I want to, because you guys talked about, this was a powerful quote. You guys talked about liturgies, and this is the importance of remembering. You guys said the good news is that our liturgies also allow us an opportunity to remember the fractures of our societal sins, because the sins that killed Jesus are the same sins that killed George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Philando Castile, and so many others. our liturgies offer us an important chance to remember the souls lost to the injustice of oppressive systems, and therefore to remember ourselves to each other in community. But what's the importance of remembering?
Man. Well, the group of folks I get to organize who are formerly incarcerated, we use this word of time theft. That the way the system of mass incarceration, which is an extension of Jim Crow, with an extension of slavery, the whole function of slavery was to rob people of time, memories, and identity.
To rob people of time,
memories, and identity.
Of identities.
Yeah.
Time, memories, and identity. Okay.
And in doing so, when you do that to a people, and you need them to be instruments of labor, and you need to dehumanize them, you do those three things. Rob them of time, memories, identity. And what we're watching right now is public policy being passed to primarily rob memory and identity, but a lot of memory, right? I remember going through middle school and high school in my public school textbook saying the Civil War was fought over economic and states' rights and slavery.
What years were you in high school?
I graduated in 2012, so 2008 to 2012. Okay. Right? It's not that long ago.
Yeah.
When you go look at the states that left the Union, they were very clear. They said, we're leaving because we want to control the Negro body, and y'all ain't going to let us. Every state that seceded said that. It was explicit. It's on monuments in real life. I remember one of the churches I worked at in Charlottesville, or when Charlottesville happened in 2017, I was working at a church in Indianapolis. The church wanted to put out a statement. And one of the elders said, and in the statement, I talked about the legacy of the Confederacy showing back up.
Wow.
And one of our elders said, no, you can't do that. Because the legacy of the Confederacy is about states' rights. And I remember sending him a picture of the monument, I think it's in Mississippi, that has their secession, and South Carolina. In both of their secession letters, it says, we are leaving because the institution of slavery is core and part and parcel of who we are. And he was like, no, that's not right. And I was like, the people who did this, like, what do you mean? Right? But when you contest memory, and when you contest narrative, and you can make that a little shaky, then you have the ability to hide behind that as a reason to not change things and address things. So, I think that's one of the three areas we have to constantly battle. And then, as individual families, like the way you talk about your family, creating those spaces in those rooms, that's so special. And more of our families have to get into that practice. And then I'll make a quick plug just as an organizer, right? Like the histories that we do tell, we got to tell a broader expression of history.
Yeah, we do.
Right? Like people should know who Fred Hampton is. People should know who Huey Newton is. People should know who George Jackson is. People know who Asada is and Kathleen Cleaver. But a lot of our Black history stops after 1965.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And that is quite unfortunate.
Yeah.
We stopped talking about King's imagination and how he shifted after 1962 or 64. So there's so much memory that we have to reclaim. And I already talked about individual stories, trying to reclaim that memory.
Yeah.
But collective cultural memory, super important.
So I think why that's so important as well is, let's kind of go full circle a bit. Again, we talk about those spaces of belonging in places where we find safety. I think would love to know if you agree with this, or if you disagree with this. As a person of color, and you walk into a space, you pretty much know very early if this is a safe space. You agree or disagree?
I agree, but what's funny is I intentionally imagine myself walking into a Jack and Jill meeting and not feeling particularly welcomed.
Oh, say.
Because
more.
because I have the ability to perform the type of, the academic term here is petty bourgeoisie, blackness, but I don't have an appetite for it. And so, and I think about all those spaces I've been in as a kid, as a teenager, as a young adult. I've been in rooms where, in Indianapolis, the first time there was a African-American giving circle, African-American Legacy Fund. I was on staff in an organization that helped start that. And to be in a room to celebrate that was interesting, because there was this particular expression of achievement that was tied to performing the way white people, and having enough capital to do that. Now let me make it a little more clear. There are 2 monuments to Abraham Lincoln that were erected after the Civil War that show an incredibly tall Abraham Lincoln. And I believe in one of the 2, but originally it had been 2 of the 2, had a freed slave holding their manacles up.
Yeah.
They have been freed. The imagery most of us have been taught is that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and freed slaves. And in doing so, and then the white folks in the North fighting the Civil War, we got free. The Civil War was bloody, it was contested, it was difficult. And one of the main drivers that turned the conflict towards emancipation successfully was the nearly 200,000 black folks, some of my ancestors, who fought for their freedom and executed their own agency. Not just those who fought on the side of the Union, but those who disrupted the Southern plantation economic system, who killed the crops, who ran away, who escaped who fought their way off the plantation. Folks enacted and engaged in their own freedom. And in history, any community that's ever gotten free has done it on their own. But there are these 2 monuments that imply the black person got free. We have a monument downtown Indianapolis of an enslaved person holding up their manacles as well. A little more liberative stance. But again, alongside, there's no black Union soldier at the monument downtown. There's just a black slave. In all of these visuals, there's an articulation or an expression that black folks got free because some white person got them free. And we are grateful and thankful, so we hold up our manacles.
Yes.
One of those 2 monuments was built by freed black folks of wealth in, I believe, Virginia after the Civil War. They didn't want to construct a monument of a soldier fighting. They didn't want to construct a freed black slave or formerly enslaved person. They wanted to construct of Abraham Lincoln and then show black people as disempowered and thankful to the white president who got them free, right?
Absolutely.
So there are certain spaces, and again, I think the work on anti-blackness for black people is really wrestling around class, is that when we dig into the worlds that we construct, are we creating monuments to show where we've been, but in a way that reinforces kind of a white power structure, a white dominance? Or are we taking seriously the work to get free and how we get ourselves free and how we got to be in relationship with each other to get free?
So I'm gonna push back on you a little bit. Yeah. Because I think this is a great. Because you guys talk about in your book, which is a great line, man. It's and I'm gonna give you guys credit. The first 10 times I use it, and then after that, man, it's free game.
Right, you forgot who
said
said it.
Because you guys talk about holy discomfort.
Yeah.
And it's such a great word in terms of how we enter and interact with spaces. And I love the word holy discomfort, because there's this idea that there can be something divine even in those places we don't always feel comfortable. And so sure. I guess my challenge to you would be, and even my wife has helped me to think differently, because I think before I would have agreed with you. I would have agreed with you before. But my wife and I, our families come from very different socioeconomic statuses. My family was very blue collar. My dad was a former police officer. My mom was a nurse. And my wife's family, her father is a cardiovascular surgeon.
Nice.
They her mother was a lawyer, and her family, they're actually, her father's from West Africa, it's from Cameroon.
Okay.
And their family is actually very educated in
Nice.
terms of how they experience education and how they experience how they as immigrants, how they have navigated through the United States has been pretty phenomenal, actually. And so I guess my disagreement would be, even as Black individuals, why do we have to attribute success with whiteness?
Yeah.
In terms of And I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but I think the thought of, and I'm not saying not you personally, but I think Blackness in particular.
Yes.
Because I think you are right. That sometimes as Black individuals, our idea of success is still viewed through the white lens, and having. You have to define what we mean by success, though. Yeah. So we're gonna get to that.
Yeah.
Because growing up in Detroit, there was sometimes the success was the accumulation of the signs of wealth. So you find, I'm not even exaggerating. You would find people who lived in the hood with brand new Cadillacs.
Of course.
I mean, it was like the sign would show.
Common in Detroit.
Rims hooked out,
right off the
22
line.
like that,
Yeah, right.
spanking clean outside every day. So I was like, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. So I want to say particularly when you talk about financial success, because I think you can have. There are many forms of success, but I think in particular, in terms of financial success and in terms of people who have risen to a place of professional acumen, because in that you do have, and it's so interesting how we talk about, even as Black individuals, not only what success looks like, because success is it still out of the white gaze, right? Or can we define Blackness and Black success with the with incorporating all of the different complexities of what it means to be Black.
Yeah.
Right. So to know that you can be Black bourgeois and still like you said, down the streets for for a cause.
But that's the difference, right? It's when I say the petty bourgeoisie, I mean like upholding a certain social standard or social norm that holds certain of Black people back. Right. So the civil rights movement probably stalls if Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier aren't sending suitcases of money to the South.
Sure.
Right. It probably stalls if King doesn't get to go to L.A. and sit with the jazz artists and the writers and who can dump large sums of money into the movement, right? Their success, I would never contend is inherently wrong. We can interrogate the efficacy of capitalism. That's a different conversation. I'm saying within the work one has to do of undertaking and understanding how anti-Blackness shows up.
Yeah.
It's like once we acquire said wealth, what we then do with it.
Absolutely.
And does it because there's the petty bourgeoisie is interested in advancing itself as an individual family versus advancing a community.
Yeah.
And the consequence and cost sometimes of being in the petty bourgeoisie is that you actually don't have access to the community anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of folks who I know who end up working in government or city government that I work with that are folks of color, and you're like, oh, you should be down for the cause. But they're not. They don't know how to be.
Sure.
No concept of it. Because actual accountability, solidarity doesn't exist in that model. Yeah. And so I would never say, so when I say my discomfort.
No, I know what you're saying.
For our listeners.
I'm just trying to create some.
No, I love it. It was like, a lot of the folks who fund and support our movement exist in that space. Black Church Coalition doesn't get to have the footing it has without that community. What is important, though, is that community has challenged itself. Those individuals have challenged themselves to say, I'm not going to step away from a broader expression of community and cloister myself or cut myself off, but it's because I'm in this status I'm going to reinvest and commit to it.
Yeah, so I'm going to make a statement, and then I would love to hear what because you talk about power and when we talk about power influence and how do we use our own power and influence to do that. What has been really great, which is learning for me, even being part of this organization, is to hear the other narrative of parents, and regardless of their income, still have to wrestle.
Doing the same struggles.
Because the struggles don't go away with economic achievement.
Exactly.
Especially if they are in predominantly white spaces.
Absolutely.
Right. It does not go away at all.
Absolutely.
There's still some wrestling that needs to be had there. So in you all's book, you all talk about the difference of power and influence.
Yes.
So regardless of where we find ourselves, how do we use our own power and influence as we navigate this journey and as we create change in our in our local environments?
Yeah. So, I mean, as an organizer, the core of my work is helping people understand power and wield power. So for most people, we have to relearn what power means. We've often been conditioned to view power as a bad thing. I don't want to be the wealthy billionaire in the suit who looks down on poor people and casts aspersions and pays people to do bad policy. That's power, right? And I don't want that. People have been on the bad end and wrong end of power most of the time. And that's most people that you know. If you're not part of the 1%, at some level, some power is going to hurt you. And so the work I get to, the gift I have with working with folks is reimagine what power means. And the definition I use is the ability to act. Power is, at its most basic, it's a neutral force that we all have, and we could use it and wield it. And when we work together and align together, we can grow it and dramatically scale the impact up. Now, where this is different than how I used to talk about it in the anti-racism space was through like social location, or what I would consider now as influence. If you are in kind of the anti-racism work, what it would say is that if you're a wealthy white person, you have a lot of power. If you're a disabled single black mother, you have no power or limited power. And in that frame, what is required for the single disabled black mother to get access to equity is for the white people to give up of themselves and give up on their power. And so a lot of energy in churches like St. Luke's, like, well, how do we get our white folks to give up their privilege and their power? And as an organizer, I'm not really interested in all that. I want you to go leverage that and use that to go make a change in the world with us. Not for us, but with us. Because some of the same conditions that are impacting you, even in all of your influence, are impacting me. And if we haven't actually got clear about the fact we need to align around that and go use that collective power, then we are in trouble. In our opposition, the folks who are most interested in creating a white supremacist state, a theocracy, they are clear about that. And we've been given a bill of goods on what it means to be an anti-racism community or a justice-seeking community that requires us to actually run away from power and constantly be trying to give it up. Yeah. And that is back to what I shared earlier of like that algorithm of anti-racism, is it's kept progress from happening. And that, I mean, I can go to a whole sociological study of it, but there's a lot of forces at play that are interested in a church like St. Luke spending the rest of its years doing book study and book study and book study on anti-racism and never realizing that, oh, wait, we have a tremendous amount of power that can go change something. It would be preferred that way by the systems of the world. Because once you wake up and say, wait, I have power and I can go use it for good and it's not inherently bad and I'm not wrong for having it, let's go get to work. Yeah. And that's what scares systems of oppression.
There's a scripture that talks about Ephesians 4, says, now unto him who is able to do exceedingly and abundantly all that you could ever ask or imagine according to the power that is already working in you. Josh, I thank you for your heart. I thank you for your work. Man, you're brilliant. I thank you for your mind. I thank you for your passion. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your willingness to be committed to a better and hopeful future. I think Indianapolis is better because of you. I think St. Luke's would be better because of you. And I think our community will be better because of you. So we pray for you and all that you continue to do. And know that you got a friend, you got a brother in Christ, you know.
Grateful for that.
Anything you need from us, anything you need from me, we are here with you because we believe in you in the work that you're doing. So on behalf of the entire community of St. Luke's, hey, man, we love you, and we thank you for your work. Thank you for your heart and all that you're doing, man.
Thank you, brother.